Hi, my name is Matthijs. I'm the CTO at Xccelerators. My favorite coffee is a double espresso from Ethiopian Yirgacheffe beans from the local roaster here in Delft.
David Aponte. It's been a while, man. ¿Cuánto
Yes,
tiempo,
sir.
amigo?
Hace un rato. That's it. It's been a little bit. It's been a little bit.
Dude, I'm stoked to have you back co-hosting here. It was a
Yep,
nice
yep.
little surprise that you just jumped on. What were your takeaways? We just talked to Matthijs, and that was pretty epic. I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it a lot. I think one of the biggest takeaways was, I think, how nuanced some of these design decisions can be. How much like how often the answer is it depends. I feel like a takeaway for me is that makes this space again just a reminder. It reminds me of how challenging it is. It's very hard to standardize right now. I think even at the tooling level, it's hard to standardize right now. And I think that makes it particularly tricky for people trying to get into the space. And I think it's awesome that there are some people who have, I guess, like growing up while this was happening, have been able to find this kind of well-needed area. And obviously there's businesses out there that are trying to meet those needs by finding good talent. I know that's a common problem, finding good talent, especially within the MLOps space, because sometimes they're more on the ML research side, have very little experience with the deployment and the infrastructure, or vice versa. Sometimes they just know infrastructure and know very little about ML and some of the nuances there. So that was one thing. I felt like over and over I heard how nuanced things can be, and very rarely do we get these like blanket answers that always apply. I think there's a desire to move in that direction, though. I heard that from him speaking about, we try, but it's hard. So yeah, that's one I could think of.
Dude, I really liked when he was breaking down the monitoring piece and he was talking about how for him it's such a headache and a nuance to have a tool that is specifically for machine learning monitoring or data monitoring or just model monitoring. And then you got to go into your Datadog or your whatever software monitoring. And he was like, there still needs to be a lot of work that happens in that space, which of course it surprised me because it feels like out of any other tooling area in the MLOps space, there's so many that
Yeah,
are in that space. That space
same,
is so crowded.
same.
And so you
Um,
you have him saying like, yeah, even with all this crowdedness, there's not what I'm looking for.
it made me think, like, for all you model deployment tools out there, just add some, some load balancing algorithms, or add to the round robin, or at
Oh
least
yeah.
traffic or something. This must already exist. There should be a way to integrate them. So yeah,
Exactly.
I know I would like that as well. So that's awesome.
Exactly. So let's do something new that we're starting right now. It is the first time I'm going to go over a few of the cool things that are happening in the community that people have posted. And I want to start out by mentioning that we have a Best of Slack newsletter. So if you want to get the top threads that are happening in the MLOps community Slack delivered directly to your inbox, sign up for that. You can find a link to the description below, or to that in the description below. And we've also got a few cool things that are happening. So there's this thing called AI MLFlow. They're building a tool that mounts the MLFlow logs and enables an AIM-based super performance UI for metrics, image, and other ML metadata comparisons. That is called AI MLFlow. It's produced by the AimyFlow people. And then we've also got some great meetups that are happening in the model observability space and explainability space. Speaking of monitoring, we were talking about it before. Get on there. You've got Arise that has Drift happening. They are interviewing different people in the machine learning space that are doing cool stuff, and they talk about what they're missing and what they're looking for in observability. And then you've got Fiddler is having an AI explained model monitoring best practices in real life that's going down. And so check all these out. Enjoy. That's all we've got for now. Oh, last one. Nanny ML. Dude, another monitoring one. It's monitoring all day today. Nanny ML just came out of stealth. They're in product hunt. You can go check them out, see what they're doing and how they're doing it. That's it. that's all we got. Let's jump into this conversation. And thanks again, David, for joining me. It's great to have you back, man.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Delighted to be here.
What was your best confinement buy over the last 2 years since we went on lockdown?
Jeez, that's a really difficult question. My best confinement buy over the last 2 years. You could have prepped me for this one.
Well, I see all kinds of scuba gear behind you. Was it
I have
anything
been
like that?
buying and doing a lot of scuba. I was in Croatia last year for a technical diving course, which essentially means going deep and for long. That was a lot of fun, and my instructor there gave me one sort of free intro workshop on underwater scooters, and that has been the most expensive free workshop I've ever had in my life.
Oh
because
my
now
God.
I had to have underwater scooters after that. It's just so much fun to cruise around. You just go so much faster than you're used to
Dude, that
cruising
sounds
over the
epic.
wrecks and stuff. Yeah.
That sounds like so much fun. How
Yeah.
deep
Yeah.
can you go with the scooter?
The scooter goes up to 100 meters, but I don't. I go up to 50.
That's pretty. Yeah. That's kind of. I mean, that gets deep. Gets deep.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, 50 is well deep enough for me. There's a lot of cool wrecks in the 50-meter range that I'm happy to explore for now.
All right, so you're doing all kinds of cool stuff when it comes to ML and MLOps. You are the CTO right now of a company that I just found out is related to some friends of ours at Go Data Driven,
Correct.
because you have the same partner parent company, I guess. And so maybe we should just start with a clear idea of what it is you're doing, what your day-to-day looks like, and how you are implementing machine learning and MLOps.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, Xcelerated as a company essentially is a training/consulting firm. So we grew out of Go Data Driven in a way, and specifically in that Go Data Driven has a lot of very senior talent of consultants that do short-time gigs. And then very often at a client afterwards, they ask like, "Hey, couldn't that consultant just stay or come on our payroll?" And the answer always was no, of course, because it doesn't work like that. And then people thought, there's two sort of problems we can solve. We can solve the staying at clients, and we can give a place to slightly less experienced folks who are still good, but need to know a bit more before they can actually really call themselves senior. And let's start a new company that focuses exactly on that. I joined at the beginning, and essentially what we do is we attract talent, we train them before they start at the client as well as during a year, with the intent of them actually transferring to the client's internal team at the end of it all. Sort of to pick up the things that the Go Data Driven consultants build, for example, and just have a sustainable growth option for those companies.
So there's some interesting things when it comes to like the training that you're giving, and I would love to hear what is hot right now as far as training goes. What is something that people are asking for?
Yeah, so in terms of the ML space, I think it has been relatively constant over the last couple of years. There's a lot of demand from candidates into doing interesting neural net-based things, preferably at medical companies. That's something that we see a lot, which is a bit of a shame because, of course, on the other side, there's hardly any medical companies really doing much with neural net-based things. So you kind of often have to disappoint people when they want to do that. In terms of data engineering and sort of this whole data landscape, I think that the hottest tools probably are still Kafka, Spark, those kinds of things. Like the typical things that you would have heard of if you're sort of adjacent to the domain, but not deeply in it.
And are people also interested in the MLOps space, like let's say the
Yes.
orchestration, the deployment side of things as well?
Yes, that's something that we've definitely seen come more and more into play, also because it's something that we have cared a lot about from the beginning of the program that we've set up. but most of the time people don't know that much tooling coming in. Right? It's more about, okay, yeah, I've built models here and there, but they probably never actually deployed them, or had them deployed by other teams, or just in very bare bones kinds of ways, and hacking it until it works, essentially. Yeah.
And so there's something, I know you can't get into too much detail because it is proprietary, or it is top secret, as we could say. And this message will self-destruct after 5 seconds, stuff like that. But you talked to me about scaling from like a couple thousand models in production to a couple, like 100,000 models in
100,000.
production?
Yeah.
Like, what is that even? That's insane to me. And can you talk us through whatever you can tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it's a client where one of our consultants was at that moment, and essentially what they had was a big network of sensors, actually it wasn't their sensors; it was sensors from their clients that they ingested data from, and what they built, or what they were building, was a platform that allowed for very easy monitoring of all these sensors. And you could think of like sensors in infrastructure, those kinds of things. So what they essentially wanted to do was train a time series model that used data from the sensor itself, as well as data from somewhat nearby sensors that showed interesting correlations with them, to predict within percentiles what the expected values were going to the next couple of hours in the future. And what they found was that because these sensors were so different, each of them actually needed an individually trained model. Like from the same blueprint, of course, but still an individually trained and deployed model. They got that working as a proof of concept. They ran on Azure with Azure Functions, but they actually ran into sort of the concurrency limits of Azure Functions itself. They already did like 1 or 2 support tickets to Microsoft saying, hey, could we get more concurrent functioning invocations? And at that point, it was mostly the bill at the end of the month that started to be prohibitive. But there were all kinds of, already interesting challenges at the 3,000 model mark, such as, deploying a new version of the code required all the models to be retrained, sort of synchronously. That worked with 3,000, and it was a manual job as well. But at the level of 100,000, that just doesn't compute anymore. So there were a lot of sort of organizational challenges in how do we do releases, and how do we sort of do that safe and in a low risk way that we had to solve along the way, essentially.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I'm going back through some of the cool stuff you've written in Slack, and I saw one that was talking about how it's like low risk releases.
Yes.
Was very important for you. Can you break that down a little bit more and what you mean by that?
Yeah. So whenever I go to a client engagement, I always ask, like when it's MLOps related, right? I always ask if we have a cool idea for something that might improve the model, what will hold us back from getting that into production today or tomorrow? And for me, that is probably the most important thing about MLOps as a movement or as a culture, right? How do we get rid of barriers to do that? And I think a very large barrier to release very often is not being able to do it safely, right? Meaning, how do we, can we even get stuff in production in automated ways? Is often step one, right? Or is it a manual thing that people need to do right in the right order? And if we get it in production and there's something wrong, does it break some downstream system, or does it corrupt downstream data, or is it like real user impact? I think that a lot of, especially the whole online inference type models really benefit from a way to say, okay, yeah, I have this thing running, but maybe as a shadow deployment somehow, right? Or maybe I want to release it only for a subset of the sensors in this case of this infrastructure business, or a subset of users. And I think that's a part where you see some tooling here and there, but I've never really found it good enough. Never offered me the flexibility that I really needed to do it in the way that I would want it to. So you often end up rolling your own there.
Out of curiosity, are the limitations you see in these existing tools because of the scale, or is it something fundamental in the API, just like what features it offers?
Yeah, very often, you see canary testing very often as a feature of a lot of these tools, but then when you look at it, you see them do random assignments for each request. That's sort of the default. And I don't think there's ever been a case where I wanted to do random canary testing. At the very least, you want to make sure that a single user at least gets a consistent experience, or a single entity that interacts with your system gets a consistent experience and doesn't hop back between models. That's the minimum. And usually there's ways to counteract this with headers or cookies, but you always have to dig, and generally you have to dig in the code base to actually find these rather than in documentation, which I find odd. That's a maturity thing, I would say.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That feels like that's a pretty common need, right? Like maybe I don't want to do random, I want to do round robin. Or I need some sort of flexibility in how I choose to route it to the service or load balance, right? And I feel like a lot of them, you'd just be happy if you could even get there and then just do canary, right? So maybe that's kind of as far as we've come so far, and now as more and more use cases are coming out. But as I'm saying that, I feel like there's web service deployments have been around for some time.
Yeah.
And that's where the funny thing is, I often hear, model deployment is like an already solved problem. Yes and no, right? Like, yes, there's lots of standardized tooling. It's kind of the same thing, but no, in the sense of like, there's still lots of gaps in the MLOps space between what is available and, let's say, pure web development. Like, there's lots of tooling that makes it really nice. And I kind of see a trend where a lot of these libraries are now going more towards, like, what's that Python library that just came out that you could do it in the web, in a browser or something like that.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
It's like that trend to make it more just web native, or I don't know what the wording is for that. But yeah, I agree. There is definitely some, like, it's mature, but to a certain point.
Yeah. And the one feature that I always want out of these ML inference things is something that a lot of web deployment tools will just never support, and that's sort of like auto batching of requests coming in.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That just seems like something that should be, almost default in every ML inference tool. Then again, I have to also say that I would generally want those more on a load balancer level than on the application level, just to sort of make sure that you don't have unneeded latency. Right? If you do auto batching and you have low periods of data coming in, of requests coming in, your load balancer round robins to different servers, they all stay active, so they might not scale down. And also all of them are waiting until their batching queue fills or times out, because it never fills up because everything goes round robin. And I think that I think there's some market for maybe a smarter load balancer for ML that can handle some of this canary testing and shadow deployments and batching.
This feels very similar, just to also the need for a scheduler, a batch scheduler. There's already some work in like the Kubernetes space where the default scheduler is not optimal. You want to batch them, right? And you already see kind of a need for like, it's, I guess, like, but this also feels like the high performance computing area, right? Like where they were thinking about how do we get something really big to work. So maybe that's what we need, more interdisciplinary, like let's leverage what has already been done and apply it to the MLOps space. Because it seems like that what you were discussing about moving it to a load balancing layer, right? Or I guess, yeah, like, I'm thinking Kubernetes, but like the Ingress or something. There, I feel like that's not an ML specific problem. That feels like a very general kind of infrastructure problem. But when you need that in an existing ML tool, it kind of, I feel like we and this has been my experience, I often feel like we conflate the issues. where it's like, oh, this is not exactly an ML issue where I need a data scientist to be that much involved. This is more like traditional infrastructure or systems engineering,
Yeah.
where we need to figure out how to organize all this stuff. But the model is like such a small, if almost insignificant portion of that. But what you brought up earlier with like routing, that I feel like is an ML specific problem, because depending on, like, I guess like there are problems where you need someone with domain expertise to be involved, but there are others, and lots of them in my experience, where you don't. It's just like some kind of vanilla infrastructure issue that you're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, and we do have the tendency to reinvent some of these infrastructure components for specifically ML, which is a bit of a shame. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of what I feel too. Like there's a lot. Sometimes I think we're better off learning from what has already been there and trying to figure out a way to leverage that, rather than creating everything from scratch all the time. Which sometimes it feels like it, but then it's not. A lot of these existing tools are just like they are inspired from something from before. Well, at least that's my opinion from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, you see a lot of cycles as well, to be honest. You want to ask a question, Demetrius, or?
No, I want to
Okay.
I want to let you guys keep going.
Sure.
I was just going to interject and say that thing that David was looking for, the browser-based Python, was called PyScript. That's all I wanted to say.
That's the one. Yeah. So it's interesting to see some of these cyclical things in terms of how we tend to solve problems. If you go back, I don't know, is it 10 years to like Uzi and Azkaban times for Hadoop scheduling?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. I'm afraid it's about that time. Everything was XML based, right? And he saw, people finding out that Uzi wasn't good enough, so they built other things, or they built stuff on top. And at a certain point, people started figuring out like, wait, maybe for these complex dependencies and these complex graph things, a markup language is not the right tool to define them. Let's start writing them all in code, right? And then we get Airflow and Luigi and Dexter and Prefect and what have you now. But then somehow we got turned around again because Argo is YAML based, and I don't have anything against Argo. It's quite a nice tool, but if you look at the YAML that you sometimes need to do stuff, it's horrendous, of course. And so I'm curious, like, what is the next pipeline tool going to be?
I feel like drag and drop, like that's another trend I noticed, where it's low code environments, which I personally like. I don't like them because I can't do what I'd like to normally do, and I can't tinker. I'm very limited by this API, and that feels like more I'm just learning some tool rather than learning something that applies beyond this tool. That's why I like working with lots of open source tooling, because a lot of them are based on these general concepts that apply versus like this super specific tool. So that's why it's not great, but I do feel like it does make people productive, particularly data scientists, when they like to iterate quickly, like drag and drop. For certain things is nice. Like I'm thinking of like Azure Data Factory in the Azure stack allows you to do the ETL very simply, drag and drop, put together some pipelines. But again, you run into lots of issues because let's say if you were to build a tool like that, that sounds like a lot to maintain, keep all these connectors up to date. Like that just would be a nightmare for someone like me. But that's what these tools have to do to keep up, to stay relevant, because they offer just enough functionality to make you productive, but not enough to allow you to customize it for what you really need.
They offer just enough to get you hooked, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of the issue, and then migrating out of them is a nightmare.
I mean, you have played with a lot of tools, right? And do you feel like that's a general pattern that you try and avoid, and that's why you lean more towards like building it yourself?
Well, let me preface that you don't want to build everything yourself for sure. But in general, when I evaluate a tool, I do evaluate how easy it is to get out of it again. Right? How core is this component to the thing that I'm building, and what if I don't like it 2 years from now? That's also, in general, I don't like frameworks. I like libraries for the same reason that David just mentioned. Frameworks tie you into a lot of things, and moving out for just a part of it can be quite difficult. Whereas if you have a bunch of libraries that don't overlap too much, you can generally just rip one part out and bring one part back in. Especially in a domain where, I think in our domain, we don't know what the interfaces should be yet, right? If you think about web app development, well, that's been, your free tier architecture or your however many tier architecture web app with your database and your middleware and stuff. That's all been sort of solved up to a point. And then each of those components can be more, is by definition more replaceable because the interface is at least clear and it's clear what the component does. But nowadays you see, bias or model fairness tooling that also handles your deployments, and that feels wrong.
Yeah, I gotta agree. I like someone, I forget who in the community brought this up, but it's like you see like the data hub or the data engineering space. They don't, for like a data warehouse tool, you don't see them add all these other tools into it, like visualization and all this stuff.
No.
Like they keep it separate. But in MLOps, we like to do that. We like to just everything in one thing, which feels like it sounds good, but from an engineering perspective, it causes a ton of headaches. Particularly the ability to extend it, maintain it, like all these different things that you don't think about when you're just eager to use it, but they become a pain like somewhere down the line. Like you're mentioning, it's very important to think, what do I need to do to get out of it? What's the cost? Like what's the, what's it going to take?
Yeah, you know why I think that is because the value of the tool in their like core value, it hasn't been proven out. And so they start to like grow, and then it becomes bloatware because they're like, oh, well, if we add deployment to this, then we know people need that. So that's like table stakes now. So we got to have that in our tool. And then, we'll just, we might as well put some monitoring on it too, because we deployed it. Now we got to monitor it. Yeah. And before you know it, it's like an end-to-end tool, and you started out with just some experiment tracker. And so that's kind of, I saw that literally at Dot Science when I was working at the company back in 2019. It was really hard for the product team to recognize, is it that what we have is not working and people don't want to buy that? Is it that we haven't found the right people to try and buy it, or that this is valuable for? Or is it just that we need to have more value propositions? And so they kept on like extending the tool. And by the end of it, it's true that you get bloatware and you're sitting there going like, man, I just want this one thing to be done well. And that's it. Like you got one job, do your one job. And I also recognize like I had such a hard time trying to put together the website for the MLOps community, the compare page for all those tools, because I remember thinking like, okay, there's like this clear defined, like etched out space, which is monitoring, right? And then you go into it and it's like, it's not really that clearly defined. And all these monitoring tools, how can you compare them against each other? Or you're like, okay, well, yeah, then there's like this deployment. That's an easy one, you would think. But then you start digging into it, and a tool would ask me, hey, can we get on the deployment part of the page? And it's like, we're an optimization tool, but we have deployment. So does that make us, it's like it's not their main value prop, but they are doing it. So then they want to be part of this compare page. And so it just makes it really hard to gauge anything.
Yeah, monitoring, you mentioned it, it's also one of these areas of this domain that really needs some fleshing out, I think. Somehow I think like a lot of, or at least my experience, right? And this is of course limited and I only see what I see, but for most ML cases that I do, or the ML is only such a small part of it and there's so much software around it that's also important. And for some reason, all the MLOps monitoring tools forget that, maybe. Like they forget that this whole software stack around it also exists and needs to be monitored. And if there's something I don't want is monitoring in different tools, right? That seems horrendous. And then can I get my data out of, monitoring tool XYZ into Prometheus or Splunk or whatever Datadog, whatever I'm using? Well, generally the answer there is no, because there's no default interface. Yeah. But it's tricky, right? And we're all just finding it out along the way and as we go. And I do like that there's, you see more and more good initiatives pop up, and as long as you make a conscious decision of what you want to invest in and what you want to use, I think there's a lot of good tools out there.
Yeah. I'm curious from your perspective, and bringing it back to like what you're doing with your company on the consulting side. How do you how do you go about making the decision of what technology you recommend this company to use? And like kind of we've already been thinking about it, right? Like, what do I have to do to get out of it? But I would love to hear what's your thought process, especially given that this space is moving really fast and there's lots of, like this tool that does everything, this tool does only one thing. I find people have lots of different opinions on what's best here, what makes sense. My thing is it probably depends on the client, right? But I'm curious, like from your end, how do you bring some sort of standardization to a very chaotic space?
I do. Yeah, I wish I knew. We don't have a lot of standardization with our clients, unfortunately, because nothing is ever greenfield. Right? We have clients on premise, we have clients on GCP, on Azure, on AWS. Their offerings vary wildly in quality, I have to say. Like there's some toolings I just don't want to touch from each of them, and there's some toolings that are great. The one bit of standardization that we do tend to see is Kubernetes. I mean, that seems to, at least in the larger organizations, seems to have done quite well. And that gives a lot of options. Then again, like how a cluster is configured varies wildly again, like with or without a service mesh, with or without default monitoring, cluster per team, cluster per company, cluster per use case. So that part is still, very, very different all over the place. In terms of, I think I already kind of said it, but in terms of how I advise tool choices is sort of through a regret minimization process, or at least that's how I try to think about it. I don't go for the thing that has the highest potential payoff or the highest expected payoff. I sort of err on the side of caution and think, okay, what is the thing that we're going to regret the least 3 years down the line? And that's generally the tool that has good APIs and good interfaces that we can migrate away from and doesn't do anything too wild. Very often for the companies that we work for, it's also not like they have hundreds or more diverse models, right? It's mostly a handful, or it's like one model but scaled to a massive scale. For the latter category, there's no off-the-shelf tooling, I think. At least I haven't found anything. So you pick what you can, like you pick your monitoring system to make sense. You pick your, you run on containers and you do all that stuff right. But the management tooling around it, you build yourself. For the other part, the handful of containers, you can get away with just good CI/CD pipelines and Prometheus, plus, some kind of model tracking or experiment tracking framework that comes off the shelf.
Do you notice a difference between the type of data that you're using? Like if you're dealing with structured data or tabular data, and then audio or images, video?
We haven't done much audio. I would say most of our use cases are probably still structured data. The use cases that aren't are images. So we do interesting projects for example, the Dutch Harbor and the Dutch Railway. Well, not the Dutch Railway Manager. So not the company that runs the trains, but the company that actually owns the tracks. I think those are generally less organized in a way. There's a lot of just Azure blob storages with a whole bunch of stuff on there that people accumulated over the years. You see, like we've built a couple of just small command line tools that manage annotations for these kinds of problems. But those were always built custom, because you needed custom rulings like, hey, which kinds of annotation sets could we merge together and which can't we merge together, and which should have priority if they conflict. And there were some interesting little things that we ended up building ourselves there. Do we see other differences? You see more experimentation, I think, with a lot of these image-based, non-structured data sets. Very often for the structured data, you very quickly get to a result that's just good enough. And then you build it, you run it, and then it's, you might iterate over it a couple of times, but it's it's closer to done soon. Whereas for the image cases, it's been much longer experimentation phases. Also because the training just takes longer, I guess.
Well, going back to what you were talking about earlier and how you're looking at when you go into companies and you're saying, what is keeping us from getting this into production tomorrow? What are some of these big barriers to getting into production?
Yeah. Very often it's manual validation steps, right? We need people to look at this output. We need to go through the code to make sure it works. We need to ask stakeholders that are unavailable for the next 3-4 weeks to see if they agree with XYZ, and that's all that needs to be done, like, already before we can even start about thinking about deploying it, right? And then deploying it means, this data source changes, so we need to change this upstream data pipeline, but we don't really have a process, or we haven't really thought about backwards incompatible changes. And then, we have to be really sure that it works, because if it breaks, then it's just broken, and there's no way to roll back, for example. So that type of, the interfaces between different data jobs or different teams even are very often not really clearly defined, and there's definitely not a deprecation path set up. Right, so that is a common cause as well. And well, you still see very often that especially data science teams consist of data scientists who just don't necessarily have experience with infrastructure or with running things in production anyway. So it might be that things have to be rewritten a lot, which is always something that is, a horrendous thing that needs to be changed as soon as possible, I think. That might be one of the biggest reasons for a lot of larger companies, at least.
Yeah, those are some really common ones, and I've seen them myself. I want to piggyback to something you said earlier about kind of the question of, like, how do you go about, thinking about standardization. I'm curious, like, specifically with respect to how do you leave the client in a good position to continue maintaining this, maybe extending it, and like, how do you leave them in a good position? I find that that's also really tricky too. It's like, how do I educate them? How do I onboard them to this? How do I, make sure that when I leave, everything is good? What's your experience in that area?
Well, that's sort of the beauty of our business model. We leave behind the people that know. So very often I didn't really have to deal with a lot of these handover problems, because I work together with the consultants who will stay at the client at the end of it all. But that's a bit of a cheat answer. I think the real answer is automate as much as possible, right? Everything that's automated is sort of safe for handover because it's written down in code. That code gets run very often. And if code gets run very often, you never really end up in a state where suddenly it's completely foobar.
I think that's really good. Like, automating things so that it's like defining code, not defined by some manual process, right? That only, this one random person knew.
Yeah.
But also, like, I had a similar thought that you said, but I just forgot it. I think it was, you stay with them, right? Or they stay with the company. In the case where they don't, how do you go about not not, I guess this is something I've encountered, automating too much. Maybe it seems like the safe bet, like we're running everything via CI/CD, but we could be doing something automated, but in a bad way, like doing something bad continuously. And I know that's maybe it's a bit harder to answer in the general case, right? Because it usually depends, but there is some tension, I believe, between wanting to automate a lot of stuff. And I think this comes from the influence of the software engineering side versus the data science side is like, hey, this is research. This is pretty raw. I need to iterate on this. They're more hesitant to just run everything end to end because, like you said, there's a lot of times manual validation involved, lots of, I guess, analysis that's required, and maybe automating that
Yeah.
sounds good, but may actually cause more harm. So I guess the question is, how do you deal with that when the consultants come across that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point that you make. You don't always end up in a situation where you can validate your model automatically for 100%, and you probably shouldn't even want that most of the time, especially if you're starting out with something. But there's still ways that you can facilitate it in an automated way. Very often at less technically mature clients, I end up doing the retraining completely in like CI/CD systems, and it opens up a pull request to a repo somewhere with a report in there saying, hey, this is what the model did, this is how it got retrained, this is how it compares to the previous iteration. If you're okay with this, press approve and it will deploy. Right, and then someone gets a notification and they'll know how to look at it, and they know what they look at because they've been looking at it for the last N times, like for the last 6 months or something. It doesn't even have to be a technical stakeholder at that point.
I see. There's lots of boring stuff that we can automate to protect us, right? And it doesn't have. Yeah, I agree. We don't have to automate everything, but there's definitely a lot that we can.
Yeah.
There's like low hanging fruit, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's sort of this is a really good platform to start automating on, because if you sit next to that stakeholder and you ask him every once in a while, hey, what do you look at when you validate this? He says, oh yeah, I look at whether this thing is bigger than that thing. Oh, well, but that's something that we can automate, right? And you sort of start automating more and more based off of what you got as feedback.
Well, I find this idea fascinating too, because it's like, where do we want to have that human check come in? And you're really designing things around that. And you're designing what is automatable, if that's a word, and then what is not, and what really needs a human there. So that kind of hard thought that needs to be put into it is an interesting design problem.
I agree. Yeah, and it's often, I often get it wrong at the beginning as well. It's not something that I can go at a client and I can't really guess how well automatable a model release is going to be. I've learned to err on the side of not automating those kinds of decisions, but automating the process and just giving them a report and literally sitting next to the stakeholders like, hey, yeah, what are you looking for? What do you want to know out of this? And try to bring those things up to the front, and then come back every once in a while. Hey, what do you look at? What don't you look at? Try to keep iterating on it. Yeah.
I've got a few rapid fire questions I want to hit you with because we got to wrap up. This has been awesome. First rapid fire one is going to be a softball. What was the last book you read?
The last book I read was Rhythm of War from Brandon Sanderson. Fantasy novel from the Oathbringer series.
Oh, nice.
The last technical book I read was O'Reilly's Database Internals, which is definitely should be on anyone's list who's interested in that sort of thing. I found it a really fun read.
All right, I like that. I haven't heard of that one yet, but I'm gonna go check it out.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, it's a good book. I have that one. I read it. I like it a lot. Yeah, that one, and what's the other one that's like a standard for data engineering?
The data intensive applications one.
Yes, that one. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Those two are like the go-to ones for me. Yep.
Yeah.
So what piece of technology are you bullish on right now that might surprise people?
Oh. Huh. That's I don't tend to be very bullish on technology, so maybe maybe I'm the wrong person to ask.
Well,
What is
talk to us
technology
about
that I'm
that.
bullish on? Right. That's
How
a
about
rough
let
one.
me
What about
let
like
me rephrase
containers?
it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but containers won't surprise anyone, right? Containers
Yeah,
are,
yeah.
you know, uh, I yeah, containers and Kubernetes and those kinds of things, of course, all are super obvious. Um, like Prometheus Grafana is also super obvious, of course.
Well, now, how about this? Just what's something that you're bullish on, just in general?
Right. I think Python is gonna stick around for a while. I've been using Go more and more. I'm not sure if it has a really good place in the MLOps space yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it could carve one out. It seems similar-ish enough to Python to be learnable by a lot of Python devs, but then infrastructure-ish enough to be useful for scaling. So maybe Go is the answer here.
Nice.
To go on.
All right, last one for you. How do you want to be remembered, man?
Oof.
Deep.
I hope I don't have to be remembered for a long while. Do you mean for the podcast or for
In
in
life.
life,
In
general
life.
life? So, well, one of the beauties about my job is that I interact with a lot of people who go through a very large development step in their time with us. They get a lot of training. I think our trainings are good. They involve a lot of these kinds of discussions, which is also a lot of fun. So I like it when people, especially ex-colleagues, remember me as, yeah, Matthijs always, when you come up with a question, he always either has an answer, can think of an answer, or will get back to you with something. And that will always help directly with what I've been doing. That's something that I've always, liked to get as feedback, of course, because it's just that impact that you can have in people's working life is pretty great.
Amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thing to be remembered by.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, a great mentor. Also, that is awesome to be able to work with you. Is a privilege that many have. So this has been cool, man. I appreciate you sitting down and talking with us. I really want to
really
thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Thanks for inviting me. This was definitely a lot of fun.
And
Yeah.
we will
I have
catch.
one question before
go.
we do go, if that's okay. What's something that's top of mind that you would like the audience to think of before they leave? Maybe something that you're working on, something that's upcoming, anything.
Yeah. There's quite a lot upcoming. We're doing PyData Meetups in person in Amsterdam again. So that's coming up on
MLOps
June
Meetups,
1st. There's
MLOps.community
MLOps meetups
meetups.
in person coming up soon. PyData London has a conference somewhere in June as well, which is supposed to be a lot of fun. If people are interested in scikit-learn and monitoring models and Prometheus specifically, I would love it if they could get in touch. I've been starting a small open source thing that should make it very easy to get some basic metrics out of scikit-learn pipelines. It's not, you know how it goes, right? Just start an open source thingy and then it kind of, just lies there for a bit waiting until you really have time to pick it up. But if someone's interested in that, I'd be happy to, discuss and spar and maybe collaborate.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think those.
Super helpful. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you
You're
so much. It
welcome.
was such
Thank
a
you.
pleasure.